children, called to unselfish devotion and his heroic self-realization. Antoine Benezet, William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Sumner, Douglas, and Lincoln, these and others, but above all, John Brown. Let me just step back to interpret here. The gift of Africa to America. Dubois and other places will talk about Africa and Asia as the mothers and fathers of civilization, and Europe as its precocious child. A more recent and almost childlike emergence out of this over 10,000-year history of human civilization that was primarily African and Asian. But Africa and the spirit of Africa has inspired, and I would argue still inspires, the best in America. What makes America unique in human history? If there is a uniqueness, and I believe there is, it is what Du Bois calls the mystic spell of Africa. The sense of that unquantifiable, that which cannot be accurately defined in scientific and empirical terms, that Africa brings to America. And Du Bois contextualizes and talks about this as a gift. And that gift, when it is fully recognized, inspires the best in white America. Which makes the opposite also true. That without Black America, the best that we know of and think of in white America would be absent. Now, Du Bois was deeply aware of the fact that until the modern epoch, the principal pole of connection between human civilization was the South-South connection. The North-South pole is very, very recent. The civilizational connection that was the foundation of much of what we today call human civilization was an African, Asian, and later on what we today would call Latin American connection. The populating of the planet emerges out of Africa, then into Asia, across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, by boat to South America and to the islands of the sea. And in every part of the world, not only do we see evidence of Africa's presence, as in Mexico, as in the South Sea Islands, as in India and China and Japan. We see evidences of ancient Africa's presence in every part of the world. But even now, population geneticists prove that what makes, or assert I should say, and prove, that what defines the human, what they call the anatomically modern human being, which appeared about 150,000 years ago, breaking off from earlier Homo erectus or near human species. By the way, I'm not talking about the Neanderthals. When anatomically modern human beings appear, they appear first in Africa. They are genetically distinct. That genetically unique population will populate Africa, will move into Asia, producing what population geneticists call the only other genetic pool, and that is the Asian gene. But what makes every human population human is that we all carry African genes. Now, when Dubois talks about the mother and father of humanity, Africa and Asia, and Europe as the precocious child, population geneticists have kind of confirmed that. In this macro sense, there is this African genetic pool. It is passed on to every human population, even up till today. The only major variation upon the African genetic gene is the Asian gene, population gene. Europe. European populations in general, that is populations that inhabit the European landmass, consist of two major, that are a hybrid of two major gene pools, 35% African and 65% Asian. Now, well, I'm not making this up, by the way. This is Cavalli Sforza and his colleagues who published a book in 1995 entitled The Geography and History of Human Genes. The most important development in our understanding of the population genetics. What was the name? Cavalli Sforza. I'll talk to you later about how to spell it. And Luca Luigi Cavalli Sforza, and two other Italians. Yes. And the title of the book is The History and Geography of Human Genes. Now, but even if we look at the genealogy of language, we discover the same thing. Martin Bernal, who has done in my mind, some of the best work, Black Athena, the third volume of it in particular, where he kind of shows what the major language groups in Africa and Western Asia are, which we call the Middle East today, and how, finally, most languages that are spoken in the world have an African origin. In fact, there are some linguists who claim that the mother tongue of all languages consists of about 7 African languages. And the most ancient language are those languages spoken in Southern Africa that are languages of click, those languages. Now, so everything scientifically, in terms of genes, in terms of language and linguistics, confirm the historic centrality of Africa in the origins of humanity as a species, and civilization as a form of the development of humanity. Du Bois asserts this. But then he goes a bit further. Yes, in his metaphorical and literary and poetic way, speaking about the mystic or spiritual spell that Africa forever has had on America, and how the best of America has been inspired by Africa. Now, what does Du Bois call the best of America or white America? He calls the best of white America that America that recognizes first the humanity of Africa. There is no greatness in America that denies Black humanity. But also for Du Bois, the recognition that the spearhead, one could say the advance guard of the fight for change and for democracy and for revolutionary change is disproportionately located among African Americans. For him, this is both a consequence of their civilizational and cultural development in Africa, but it is also connected to the inevitability and necessity, just for survival, of Black resistance. No group has so consistently fought for progress as have African. It is almost an unconditional characteristic of our being. To say Black, you're almost saying resistance. And that's from Toussaint Louverture, Denmark Vesey, Harriet, up to Ferguson. Now, with this backdrop, Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction. He calls it his magnum opus, his greatest work. This is something he had been thinking about since his days as a student of this and at Harvard University. He pulls together not just the historical evidence, and he's limited because he can't get into the archives. So the book, what it lacks in theoretical and archival empirical and archival documentation, it makes up for with these broad conceptualizations. And if I might just say a little footnote here. Du Bois conceptualizes in a very unique, we're saying to Cindy, almost idiosyncratic way. His concepts are not so bounded as we expect in most rational presentations of math. His conceptualizations are also very artistic and poetic. And so he conceptualizes often through metaphors. And so he uses metaphor very powerfully. We talked about this before in Souls of Black Folk. The veil, metaphor for the color line. It's the best metaphor describing the racial division in the United States that I can imagine. And for him, you could not conceptualize the existential realities of racial separation without a concept like the veil. And we said about the veil. What do we know about the veil? A veiled woman in certain societies can see out, but the outside world does not see in. I often talk about the process of veiling, self-veiling on the down low. I veiled myself. Passing for white, self-veiling. You know what I'm saying? It is a form of self-sabotage. But there is the veil, and it's self-veiling, but the veil is this powerful metaphor where the outer world, to use Dubois's language, does not know the world within the veil. Yes, I'll get that. But those within the veil know the world outside. So black folk know white people in ways that white people have no idea of what is going on with black people. And I often say, you know, it would be good if white people listen to black people. But the veil prevents it. Of course, white people veil themselves. The whole concept of whiteness is a veil. See? It's a form of veiling that says, I'm white, and in fact, and this is an irony, though not recognized, in adopting whiteness, we deny humanity. It always makes the argument. It is only in that organic link to blackness that white humanity can ever be realized. But in linking or uniting with blackness, it is an act of racial betrayal. And it is treated as such by the white world. Everybody knows that. You get too close to black people, you are seen as a traitor to your, quote, race. And the interesting thing is that your, quote, race is such a recent development that even people who claim to be white can't tell you the history of whiteness, or when they became white, or why they want to be white. And that's the biggest question. It is an existential dilemma that Sartre and other existentialists would refer to as an absurd situation. Whiteness itself is an absurdity, but an absurdity that is made necessary by a social system that does not permit, or only permits at a high penalty, white folk to betray or to be traitors to whiteness. Let me just a quick thing on this, because I want to make a difference between, then I'll get that deeply into language. I want to make a difference between the economic system and the social system. The American social system is a unique social system predicated upon white supremacy. Now, by social system, we're talking about the relationships between people in a society, what regulates and governs them, how society gives cultural and other meanings to various things that happen in society, how societies define various groups within it. This is a social system. You know, a lot of people would say, well, you have to understand the political economy. There is so much that goes on among human beings in a society like ours that cannot be explained by economic relationships. Now, I want to come back, but I'm not getting away from the political economy or radical political economy, any of that. But I just want us to recognize that there's a larger set of realities. Now, what is the American social system? What is indispensable to the American social system? And I would argue is white supremacy. That is the idea that whites are superior, that whites deserve, that whites should be privileged, and a society is a system or structure to promote whiteness and white people over, in particular, black people. Without white supremacy, the social system collapses. Without white supremacy, that is the necessary component and foundation of the American social system. Now, as I mentioned before, in racial terms, the American social system is predicated upon a black-white binary. That is not the only racial division within it, but it is the inevitable foundation of it. Now, what are the meanings to black and white? Now, none of us are quote black, none of us are white. There is no such thing as a physically white person or physically black person. So we can cast that aside. Although if you're black and you used to see black people, white people might look white. And if you're white and you're used to mainly looking at white people, black people look black or very dark or exotic at least. And then, of course, with all of the symbology of race, even if that we socialized with and brought up with, even if you look at a black person and he or she is brown, what you see too often are those symbols that you were brought up with. So the person looks blacker than really or she really is. But what does whiteness mean and what does blackness mean? First of all, to be white in social terms is to be not black. Simple. If you were in a society where there were all white people, you would not need a concept of whiteness. You would be Finnish, or you would be Norwegian, or you would be whatever Northern European country that didn't have black people in it. A concept of whiteness is needed when you have a concept of blackness and a social system that privileges whiteness over blackness and any other group of people who are not white. So if whiteness is the negation of blackness, then what is blackness? Blackness is the negation of all things human. Which explains why no one in the society, immigrant from anywhere in the world, even from black countries, will say, in effect, I am not black, don't want to be black, and don't get it confused. No white person, well, let's say 98%, of white people not only want to be white, but they do not want to be black. And there is what one author called, in the racial imagination of white people, a lust and loathing of blackness. Lustfulness, a desire to imitate the spirit, the spiritual qualities of black people. But I don't want to be black. I abhor what blackness means in our society. But I wish to appropriate the spirit of black people. And of course, every white person, consciously and unconsciously, realizes that in a crunch, like a big economic crisis, when things are bad for white people, we can always turn to black people. They will fight. They will resist. Right? But in the meantime, we'll vote. I think that explains, I mean, without going for a whole lot of rigmarole, I think that gets it. And so the institutions, the social structures, are all organized around an anti-black, white supremacist value system. Now, of course, the economy and the political economy, especially in its radical articulation, explain what goes on in production and distribution. But it does not explain the assumptions that guide the organization of both production and distribution. I'll explain, I don't know whether I put that, that's what we can come back. Now, so Du Bois begins differently than, let us say, Marx or the radical wing of European enlightenment. He begins what is the existential reality for every black person: white supremacy. Constant, permanent, unforgiving. And as he would say in an essay he wrote in the second half of the second decade of the 20th century, when talking about the first black person to be the heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson. You know, once Jack Johnson won the heavyweight title, against all odds, quote, ended civilization as we knew it. He was criminalized. He was criminalized for his lifestyle, that he dated white women, that he drove fast cars, and that he wore fine clothes. Yes. And Du Bois would say in defending Jack Johnson, who the white world criminalized, he said his crime is his blackness, his unforgivable blackness. He said his blackness is the crime of crimes. Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and want to understand the prison industrial complex? I mean, there are many things to understand. But let us begin with the fact. Those young men and women, their greatest crime is their blackness. It is the crime of crime in America. Now, so he sees race, he understands race. No social scientists have understood it or attempted to understand it as he had. That is why even up till today, there is nothing that transcends Du Bois in this understanding of race. He looks at it in multiple ways and is constantly observing it. When he writes an autobiography, his second autobiography, he entitles it Dusk of Dawn, subtitled The History of a Race Concept. That's his autobiography. So his life, as he saw it in 1940 when he writes his second autobiography, was his engagement in an attempt to understand race. Most thinkers who have been in any way serious about the question of race, if they have spent a year or two on it, that's a lot. He spent an entire lifetime. That's what it would require. And here's this great genius who devoted his life to understanding race. He writes Black Reconstruction. As I said, he begins it. First chapter is called The Black World. And he says, think about the third paragraph of the first chapter. The slaves were everything African. I wish to underline this concept. It's our way of saying today the black person is everything African. We are not just from a single region of Africa, although most come from West and Central Africa. We are not from one linguistic, religious, or ethnic group in Africa. We are emerging because of the slave trade, because of the plantation system, because of the brutal system of seasoning, which separated people from families, from traditional ethnic groups. So in the end, the enslaved African was everything African. We look like everything from a Somalian and an Ethiopian to an Angolan and a Congolese and a Nigerian and a Ghanaian and so on and so forth. You see all of these phenotypes among Africans in the Western Hemisphere, but African Americans in particular. But he makes another assertion. And this is very, very important. That the enslaved Africans were proletariat. Cotton was in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century what oil is today. So we can speak of the form of labor that these workers did as extractive of a raw material, which in many ways drove the world economy. Now, when you get to Haiti, the sugar, but by the time of the late 18th, early 19th century, it becomes cotton. It produced the great wealth of the Western world that laid the foundation for the Industrial Revolution. But what was slavery? Many people, react against the word slavery today. But listen, when we say slavery, what we are talking about is the most intensely exploitative form of capitalist proletariat labor. The slave, as a workforce, as a proletariat, precedes the white working class in the United States. Millions of black workers constituting a strategic workforce on the one side, and a relatively small, insignificant to the economic life of the country, white proletariat. So the foundation of the formation of class in the United States is this black proletariat, which we give the name of slave or enslaved people. But slavery as a form of labor, especially in the modern or capitalist phase of human development, is just another name for highly exploited or super or hyper exploited labor. Put another way, no labor in the modern world has been so highly and severely and intensely exploited as has African labor. No labor has done more to produce the foundations, the wealth and economic foundations of modern capitalism as has African labor. So among the gifts is also the gift of labor. America would not be America. The rapid economic development, the movement west, the wars fought against native people without the wealth produced by enslaved Africans. This again is proletarian labor. Now, in the time of slavery, most white workers, even the most advanced immigrant German labor who came to the United States, who've been a part of the Marxist movement, of the radical movements of the 1840s and 1850s, when they came to the United States, they did not understand enslaved labor as a part of the labor movement. So they would take the position, well, We fight for free workers. And we will not unite with the slaves because they are a threat to the jobs of white workers. And this mindset and this division exists up till today. The American labor movement is severely limited by the assumptions of race. So it talks about the black man. Now, he will go further. And this is probably one of the most explosive chapters ever produced in historical writing of American social science. And that is chapter 4, Black Reconstruction, entitled simply A General Strike. Dubois makes the claim, well, first of all, in his portrayal of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the heroic character is the collective black resistance. There's no more consistent force in the fight against enslavement than black folk, the slaves themselves. He says after 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was adopted, 500,000 Africans, through various forms of resistance to the plantation, undermined the plantation economy. It was not just the superior military of the North, and it was superior. It was large. The South in population was half the size of the North. And then when you consider at least one half of the Southern population were Africans and enslaved, that meant that a very small nation, that is the South, the Confederacy, was fighting a much larger nation, the North. Some people ask, well, why did it take so long to defeat the South? Well, because the North, even Lincoln, was not committed to the overturning of slavery. Their objective was to bring the South, the rebelling states, back into the Union, not to bring them back in as free states, but to bring them back in with some modification of slavery. The North would pay for slaves that were liberated, was one scheme. But they were not committed. It was only when Lincoln and others realized that the South could not be defeated without liberating the Africans from slavery. But more than that, Northern people, especially Northern workers, were not willing for a protracted and prolonged war against the South. And so, with the Emancipation Proclamation, what became possible was for something like 200,000 Africans to join the Union Army or to join the cause of the Union Army by various acts of sabotage, like Harriet Tubman being behind the lines of the Confederacy spy, and so on. Much of what the Northern Army was able to do was because of black people who knew the South, who knew the backwoods, and so on. But Du Bois said also black labor withholding their labor, breaking their tools, sabotaging cotton production. The defeat of the South was far more than a defeat by the North of Southern rebellion. It was in the end a victory, as Du Bois conceived, of the black working class, who struck the first, most consistent blows for their own freedom. And hence, the defeat of Reconstruction, as Dubois calls it, is a counter-revolution. And as I like to talk about it, from 1877 up till now, the nation, and especially Black people, have been living a long counter-revolution. The forces of counter-revolution that were not just suffered, that overturned Reconstruction, those forces took power and have held it up till now, with window dressings of liberal democracy. The very fact that Black folk only became citizens of the United States with the protection of the law 50 years ago, after almost 400 years in this country, cannot be seen as anything but a counter-revolution. The fact that Black people have lived most of our time, 20 generations approximately, under one or another form of racial terror cannot be taken lightly in our understanding of what America is politically, socially, economically, and otherwise. And that we are now returning in the second decade of the 21st century to the most brutal forms of racial terror is not a small matter. Let me just end this couple more things about this group. I mentioned this last week. I want to mention it again. I had always assumed that that with the overturning of Reconstruction, the planter class returned to power in kind of a different guise. Dubois argues something very different. He says, in the Civil War, the planter class, which consists of about 16,000 families and individuals, was ruined, was destroyed in the Civil War. That the new ruling class in the South emerged from the poor white. And if you think about it, Southern culture after the defeat of Reconstruction is not the same white Southern culture that existed under enslavement. The poor white emerged as the ruling elite and ruling class of the South, with all of their animus and hatred towards Black people, all of the psychological insecurities, all of the bad faith, all of what Sartre would call the collective and pathological bad faith of the Southern poor white now becomes the elite in the South. But with the end of Reconstruction, the North, the quote liberal North, is literally saying, we have a Negro problem, we have a Black problem. Let the Southern whites handle it. They know the Negro. And thus, the system of control and management of African Americans was devised by Southern whites and by those elements that come from the poor whites that rose to power. But in some ways, on race, the tail wagged the dog. because the Southern concepts of race become a part of the national framework of race. Maybe not as harsh in the North as in the South, but nonetheless the same or similar. Look at today. We're waging a struggle against gentrification. See what I'm saying? A friend of mine just had an article, an op-ed piece in the Daily News. He said that gentrification is a new Jim Crow, producing right here in North Philadelphia, my beloved North Philadelphia, a Jim Crow area. And you don't need signs to say colored and white. All you need is a police force that racially profiles you when you come into the neighborhood that you once lived in. And what we see in this fight against gentrification is almost a low-level form of a class conflict along the color line. You read the Temple News, and it's almost completely devoted to gentrification and its fallout. 2 people robbed in Progress Plaza in broad daylight. That's fight against gentrification. Student home apartment broken into at 18th and Diamond. And on and on and on. Here is, yes, here's gentrification as a new symbology for racial, for white supremacy. And that's all it is. Everybody recognizes. Some academics will say, well, it's just a normal process of revitalization of communities. It's not just that. So when he talks about a new Jim Crow, he is referencing a Southern modality of handling the race question. But here you have it being implanted probably more severely in North Philadelphia and in Philadelphia and San Francisco and New York and Chicago than it was in the South. Black Southerners will tell you. Martin Luther King said it when he brought the civil rights movement to Chicago. And he said, in the South, I saw them wave the Confederate flag. But when I marched to the suburbs of Chicago, they brought out the swastika arms. This almost, most violent and extreme forms of racism. Okay. So the social system is infused with the racial concepts of the South. Kind of the South loses the war, but rises again, as they would say, through the national framework of race, which now with the Tea Party, the Republican Party, the corporate Democrats, neoliberal capitalism, this new form of rule, anti-democratic rule by the 1/10 of 1%, we see reappear the old forms of racial organization of society. The last. Dubois argued that in the period of Reconstruction, if African Americans had their civil and political rights protected as they should have been with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, that what he calls a form of the dictatorship of the black proletariat could have been developed in several states, and he names them: South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, and probably if an alliance with the white poor could have held, maybe Georgia, maybe North Carolina, and so on and so forth. But certainly in those states with absolute black majorities, what would have been established is what he called a form of the dictatorship of the black proletariat. Now, when he uses the concept dictatorship of the black proletariat, He is talking about a new form of democracy, a form of radical democracy. A quite striking understanding, and it fits with this complicated, idiosyncratic, bold, imaginative, almost artistic framing of the problem of Reconstruction in American history. He reframes everything from the standpoint, as Cornell says it, the plebeian concept. It's not from the elite black, from the plebeian, the working class, the ordinary black. Extraordinary. So, and I'll end here. So even as he writes this book, people say it's very difficult to understand. It is, unless you understand his framework. Even as he writes this history of Reconstruction, study of day-to-day life, observing how ordinary people think and live. He's doing what I call historical logic, which is the challenge to the Marxian dyad of class conflict, of opposing classes. Dubois sees a triad, the segmentation of the working class based upon race. Race defies and undermines the possibility of a dyadic, dialectic conflict, makes it triadic. And if the dialectic operates under these circumstances, it is a dialectic through triads, through threes rather than twos. Okay? So it is a logic, it is a historical logic, it's set up that way. But then it is an understanding of the modalities and inevitabilities of class and race, and how race is a conditionality for class. You cannot talk about class and class consciousness and class struggle without understanding it's conditioned by race. And hence, and I see my good friend Jackson from the University of Pennsylvania. Jackson asks the question, but doesn't the triad make the social system more stable? It is a way for the ruling elite to hide itself behind the white mass of workers and middle class people. Indeed, it does. Because the proclivity, the tendency historically is for most white people to deny a class existence, sometimes called the middle, I'm a middle class person. Every white person is a part of the middle class. There are no white workers. But one thing is for certain. Even if I see myself as a worker and a member of a trade union, and so Du Bois comes forward with this unbelievable concept called the wage for whiteness. A psychological and ontological wage. I might be poor, but I'm white. Whiteness represents, if nothing else, possibility. Might be bad now, but as long as I'm white, I'll never worry about being black. It's speculation. But I think ethnography and so on will demonstrate something similar to that. It is, lastly, what Du Bois does just with the working class. It's what Jean-Paul Sartre keep talking about, because it's one of my favorites. Tried to do an important work of his, I think his last great philosophical work. Where he attempts to combine what he says is historical materialism with existentialism. The Marxist paradigm of objective class relationships with an understanding of the day-to-day realities, lived realities of workers themselves. What Du Bois does is precisely that. What he does is to look at objective class and see how it is shaped and reshaped, produced and reproduced through the prisms of race and experiences of the African American. So I'll stop there. Maybe you have some questions that we can, discussions that we could have. Thank you very much. Well, not exactly, but it was that compromise.
It was a compromise.
Yes. What he's mentioning, I think everybody knows, the 3/5 clause of the original Constitution. The Constitution before it's amended, the Constitution before the Bill of Rights, the Constitution before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. There's a clause that guarantees Southern political supremacy, and that is called the 3/5 clause. And that meant that for every 5 enslaved Africans that a person owned, he would have 3 votes. So it's a 3/5 clause. It guaranteed at least political equality with the North, but actually a political supremacy. And that's why the South rebelled against the thought of even modifying slavery.
Right, because the South didn't receive each slave as one group.
That's right, that's right, that's
So
right.
North said, no, we can't have it.
That's right, absolutely. Absolutely. And so you get the 3/5 clause, which is the compromise.
Right.
This is very interesting.
The second Reconstruction, was that 1965? What was that?
This is a very interesting question. Was the Third American Revolution a civil rights movement? And was the second Reconstruction the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act? And I would say no. First of all, the Second American Revolution is the greatest American Revolution. Because it emancipated 4 million people. More people were emancipated in the Second American Revolution than in the First American.
That's it, second
And yes, and the second, yes, and obviously the first Reconstruction was built upon the overturning of slavery. Now, for the 60s to have been a second Reconstruction, it would have been what Martin Luther King, it would have to have been what Martin Luther King envisioned. It would have to go side by side the fight against racism, poverty, and militarism, which meant a radical change in the economic and political system of the United States. And that didn't happen.
But you still not seeing the norm. You got the Voting Rights Act that has to be signed by the president.
Yes,
After so many years.
That's right.
Even to this day.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And the attack upon it.
Nobody else has a Voting Rights Act.
That's right. I agree with you. I agree with you. Tim.
Pretty quick. First one is President is bold and agitating Abraham Lincoln to good.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very important, if I could just answer that within the next, I think that's a very important point. Many abolitionists, after Lincoln was elected, after the Civil War begins, say, well, we'll leave it in the hands of Lincoln. Douglas pushed Lincoln to take a more forthright position. Now, the Lincoln administration is divided because it has people who wanted to bring the South back into the Union, but did not want slavery to be ended. Lincoln, in his writings, vacillates between the two poles. until it was necessary to take a firm stance. But I agree with you. Frederick Douglass was always on the case that the Civil War, what Dubois would call, had to be turned into a revolutionary war. Not just a civil war, not just a sectional war, but it had to become a revolutionary war. And it becomes a revolutionary war to the extent that it emancipates 4 million slaves. Without that, there would have been a back and forth for years. And what, again, Du Bois says, and this is where Frederick Douglass is such a paramount figure and a central political figure, seldom spoken about in that period, is his demanding and pushing Lincoln to move from a centrist to a revolutionary position.
Question number 2, you speak about economic exploitation of African Americans. Would you consider the exploitation of Black Africans major white universities part of that?
No question. I think the system of the exploitation of Black people and Black labor in particular, which is kind of like 98% of this, is on every level. I don't care whether it's in sports, whether it's in entertainment, whether it's in universities, whether it's in these low-paying, sub-minimum wage jobs, and that's why that which Black people, most of us, can pass on to our children and grandchildren is not wealth, but our poverty. It is the main thing that we pass from generation to generation. And it is not because we are lazy. It is not because we live in a culture of poverty. It's because we live in a political economy that needs what is known as a reserve army of the poor and unemployed. And when you don't need them anymore, you lock them up. Or you contain and control them under a system of police rules. This is what we're looking at. Oh, I'm sorry.
Seems, it appears to me that I'm more about it.
So the question, that's because it is most pronounced here. And this is why this new Jim Crow, implanting what we had normally thought was a Southern system in urban cities. And it is ruthless, it is vicious, and I was reading a study in the Washington Post today, where they say the most gentrified cities, those cities which are ruthlessly gentrified, also have this rapid decline in Black population, although the overall population increases. And they are the liberal Democrat cities. So whites who gentrify, who tend to be educated, more upper middle class, and more liberal on questions of sexuality, gender, maybe even the environment. When it comes to race, it's the same old pattern. You have to leave. Go ahead.
Well, that's what I wanted to I've been a revolutionary and fighting this relationship, speaking language, since I can remember. I was born in South Philadelphia, and I used to gang war every day. But every day, we fought white people every day. So I came up already knowing that there was a division between us. But when I had an opportunity to go to school, and we started talking about these cultural exchange, and trying to, let's say, engage one another as we try to develop. And man, I have never in my life could imagine that I would be part of a Waiting Pain Development Coalition that we're fighting for in high school to remain a public high school in a community that has no school. And we get this onslaught of white racial hatred because of this fight of this school and trying to preserve our community. Then, to top it off, we have a union who is going in partnership with us, label us as extortionists, gangsters, and everything. It just seems as though even the common individual, the folks who run, because Yorktown is a town where folks actually folks don't know, Yorktown was the first urban minority ownership in the country. And here these folks trying to preserve their home, and here comes this onslaught. And the thing that really bothered me, the union really destroyed me. The thing that bothered me is we have these so-called young students who are calling themselves being educated to call us crackhead, junkies. We don't have no reason to be fighting for our community. It's just that right now, it's like we're worse than what we was back in the days of slavery.
This is very interesting. I don't everybody understand the time he was talking about. He's talking about temples dying at, prices underneath Woodington High School, which is in the middle of Yorktown, Jefferson, Madison, Harrison, Cambridge, the east side of Broad Street, north of Cecil B. Moore, is this black working class area. Temple is on two sides of Broad Street. The west side is different than the east side, and it's because of Yorktown, this first development of black home ownership in the history of America. That didn't mean that individuals didn't own a home here and there, but a whole community where blacks own their homes and have maintained this for 60 years. And now, as Priscilla Wood said, we feel vulnerable. We feel threatened by this behemoth north of us. And who is to protect us from it? And it seems like the politicians, you mentioned Labor's District Council, so-called union, in cahoots with this great gentrifier. And the fight that Yorktown is putting up is unbelievable. Now, the great thing, and this is where I am always humbled by the progressive students here at Temple. These students represent something so unique, and I think everybody from back in the days will have to admit that they are at least as good as we were. I think that, to tell you the truth, I think they're smart. But disrupting and calling into question this policy of gentrification and literally saying, you ain't gonna do it in my name. I'm not a part of this. In fact, they demonstrated against Mayor Nutter yesterday. The students, they only had 45 minutes and they stepped to him. So a great protest movement. And this is why, while we look forward, we got to go back to those days of the great civil rights movement when Martin Luther King, because you see, one of the things going on here, I'm going to end on this because we got to be out of here by 7:30, went a little over last time. Martin Luther King and Southern Christian Leadership Conference, when they went in to Birmingham, Alabama in the spring of 1963. In case y'all didn't know, Birmingham set the stage for the March on Washington. Had Birmingham failed, you would not have had that march like that, but it was because of the success of the resistance in Birmingham. And one of the things that King said when he went in there, because the establishment, including most of the black leaders in Birmingham, Alabama, said they didn't want King, you're an outsider. And King said we have a right to protest for right. And I always say, protest is the highest form of defense of your citizenship and democracy. So when the students protest, and even though, and they know, and I'll tell you, Tyrone, I said to everybody, if you don't know these students, it's worth your while to get to know them. Because they have put everything on the line in this fight. And as I said last time, you know, we march, and my dear friend Pam Africa was here. You know, we marched against Corbett last Tuesday. He signed that bill, we shut him down, you know, with our chants and so on and so forth. And I saw a guy there, I thought he was a Temple undercover cop. He's at every demonstration that we have on the campus. I come to find out he's working with the police, the Philadelphia po-po, as they say. And I mean, you know, he was, you know, like they say in the street, he was gritting on me like a thug, came with that thuggish thing. You know, which was no thing, by the way. But my point is, who in a so-called democracy is against protest? Legal protest for what is right. The students here last semester sat in the dean's office, sat in at the board of trustees, and now they try to criminalize and outlaw protest. But, you know, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, but it is truth which sways the future. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It is our confidence in the fact that we are right and that we're standing up for justice. And when you have that conviction, it's very hard to turn you around. So listen, y'all, thank you very, very much. It's always great. Next week, if everybody can try to get here on time, including the student organizers, we're going to have Glenn Ford, the great Glenn Ford, outstanding journalist, here to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and the 21st century Blackness leadership class. Okay, thank you very much. Great question.